Hello, Alison. Thank you for joining me.
Hi.
Would it be possible before we start, if you tell me a bit about your background, really? Is that possible?
I became interested in dyslexia when I was working at an agricultural college
Oh.
in about 2004. Um, and it was these bright, articulate boys who couldn't read very well or write very well. So that's what led me down the path to dyslexia teaching.
So that was just, I suppose, historical classic dyslexic sort of definition, wasn't it? I suppose.
Yes.
We're here today to talk about dyspraxia. So if I could ask you the first question, which is, what actually is dyspraxia in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, it's the praxia bit is based on the Greek word and it's practice. Practice, bad practice is what it means, basically. And really it's about sensory input and motor output. And that has an effect for the dyspraxic person on balance, posture, proprioception, how the head is in relation to the body. And it has an effect on spatial awareness and coordination. Um, so I think the bottom line is it's about low muscle tone, floppy muscles, and hypermobile joints, like double jointed. Um, for a child with dyspraxia, it's going to impact on catching, throwing, riding a bike, running, all those things. But it's I think dyspraxia is uh, complicated because it's physical and cognitive. So there's a cognitive impact too as a result of the motor aspect of it. And that's impacting on
I think you've
cognition,
stopped.
perceptual skills, social skills, those things. And the cognitive um, aspect of it has an impact on executive function, that aspect of cognitive processing. So also with dyspraxia, you'll see an attention deficit and a organizational difficulties too. Um, and with dyspraxia, there's a few things to do with the research into it as well that are worth mentioning. So if you have a brain scan,
Mhm.
there's no sign of brain damage with dyspraxia. Um, but the research into it has found that it affects the central nervous system, and it's thought to be immaturities in neuron development that cause dyspraxia. But there's also a link with there seems to be a link with birth, whether it's a traumatic birth or not, and a link with genetics, whether it's in the family. So that's my understanding of dyspraxia.
Um, can I go over some of the stuff you said? Can you first of all explain what executive order is? What executive order is? How would you define that?
Executive function, I would say it's associated with memory and working memory. Um, ADHD is an executive function disorder. So um, you can see there's an overlap with dyspraxia. Really, it's about difficulties with praxis, and then there's a knock-on effect where there's an attention deficit as well due to the motor weakness.
Excellent, thank you. I was diagnosed as dyslexic from about 7, really. And I couldn't do coordination. I was with my brother over the weekend, and he was still going on about the fact he could never teach me football. And as an adult, I was diagnosed as dyspraxic. I used to do that at school because that used to be the double joint that used to
Oh,
get
wow.
people upset. But it was interesting that looking back on it, it wasn't really distinguished from dyslexia. So
No.
you just had dyslexia, and because of that, you were clumsy, and that was it,
Yeah.
really. They hadn't really sort of developed the knowledge, really, to be able to distinguish between dyslexic traits and dyspraxic traits, because you can be both dyslexic and
Yes.
dyspraxic, or dyspraxic and ADHD, can't you? So
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
cross
There's so
over.
much over linking and overlaps.
So
Yeah,
would you say
that's
the
true.
core difference is the motor coordination? Or is that got to be the core?
Yeah.
Is that both gross or fine motor?
Both.
Would you
Both gross and fine.
can you
Yeah.
explain the difference between the two, please?
Yeah, the gross motor skills, the fine motor skills are the finer types of coordination. So it's more like writing with a pen, holding cutlery, tying shoelaces, fastening buttons. And the gross motor skills are the larger motor skills, really. So that will affect the kind of bilateral coordination when you're riding a bike, and it will affect running, climbing trees, those sorts of things.
Thank you. None of those things I could ever do. Um, how do you know if you've got dyspraxia? How would you know if you've got dyspraxia?
Well, for me, if I look back to childhood now, there were signs, but it was, 1960s. So I was in the kind of baby intensive care unit for a few weeks after I was born because I couldn't swallow.
Mm.
And then there were milestones that weren't met at the expected time. So I didn't ever crawl, I bottom shuffled,
Mhm.
and I didn't actually walk
Mhm.
until I was 22 months
Mhm.
old.
Mhm.
And then a bit later on at junior school, there were signs educationally. So I was in year 3, I'd been coming up for 8 years old, and I still couldn't read. But suddenly I did read. And when I read, I can remember this to this day, but when I did start reading, I was up at the top of the class for reading, having not been able to read at all. So I think those were indicators of dyspraxia. And then when I was dyslexia teacher training, one of the reading list books had a checklist for dyspraxia, and I ticked all the boxes, but I hadn't really come across dyspraxia. So it was kind of a relief to realize that explained certain behaviors. So a few years later, in 2018, I was referred to a neurologist with migraines. And I think it's very hard for adults to get a diagnosis anyway. So I kind of seized the moment with that and asked him about how I would go about getting assessed for dyspraxia. And he actually did it there and then. And he tested my ability to mimic and my ability to balance across the floor. And I couldn't do either. So it was kind of clear to him it was dyspraxia. But because he obviously knew there's a cognitive element too, which he felt would have an impact, he referred me to a neuropsychologist. And she found dyspraxia too, of course, but she also tested executive function.
Mhm.
And she found that the executive function difficulties actually trump the difficulties with praxis. Um, I'm conscious with diagnosis with younger people that because of the cognitive and physical nature of dyspraxia, there's quite a lot of routes to diagnosis. So it could be through an occupational therapist, it could be through a specialist teacher, assessor, or a psychologist. The thing I found at secondary school was that I'd have pupils who the occupational therapist would say they didn't fit the criteria for dyspraxia physically. But if they had an assessment from a specialist teacher or a psychologist, they would be found to have dyspraxia cognitively and having an effect in the classroom, which is quite interesting, really.
It is. If the SAS guidance is quite clear, isn't it? So people go on to the SAS website of adults. There's a checklist that people can look at and read, and the dyspraxic guidance on how to assess for specialist teachers is available free of charge on the SAS website. So people are welcome to look at that. It was interesting you talked about the birth, because I had a very traumatized birth.
I did, yeah.
Throughout some age yourself, so at the 60s and 70s, it was very much put down to, because you've had a traumatic birth, because you were so premature, at some point you are going to connect. So don't worry too much you haven't got coordination difficulties.
Oh, yeah.
So don't worry too much you're not reading, because at some point it's going to connect. And it's interesting. They had this whole theory of, I think it was called readiness for reading and things like that in the 60s, which I think they didn't always connect, I think, the medical and the educational side. And it's interesting what you were saying about assessments from different professionals. Sometimes we don't always link that up from the medical perspective to the educational perspective.
No,
that's one of
true.
the biggest dangers in diagnosing dyspraxia. There could be another underlying medical issue that's more serious.
Yeah.
It's looking at medical conditions. So it is advisable to look at the SAS guidance very carefully if people are watching this who are going to do assessments.
Yes.
But it all listed there, what the characteristics you need to be looking for.
Because it's such a mixed bag, really. Yeah.
Probably more than any, because ADHD is definitely more on the medical side. I mean, for adults, it could be done by obviously relevantly qualified assessor, a teacher assessor, but for dyspraxia, it's one of these things that sort of DCD sort of comes in between both, doesn't it? Really, it's sort of, it seems to be the thing that's left once you've ruled everything else. Really,
it causes confusion. I think dyspraxia.
Yeah, definitely. What have you found as a dyspraxic person? What have you found most useful in coping with your day-to-day sort of professional life, really?
Well, I've realised that exercise is really, really important for me as a release, but also because I've realised it is building up weak muscles and joints too. So since about 2015, I've been running most days. Not quickly, I'm not a fast runner, but I like running. The other thing I found really, really helpful is yoga. And I do yoga with Adrienne on YouTube once or twice a day. And I know that that's helping with every aspect of physical dyspraxia, really. I've read that there's a kind of caveat with that, though, that I think some medical practitioners would advise caution with yoga and dyspraxia just due to the muscles and joints being weaker. The other thing that's been really, really helpful for me was when I found out about the executive function side, having that side of it, I looked more into ADHD strategies, and I found it's helped me to get a better understanding of the kind of impulsive behaviours I might have and the misconstruing social situations. I think it's helped me take a step back. So I've got those sort of attention quietening, hyperactive quietening strategies too. I've got a stop strategy where I just stop and take a step. I think with dyspraxia, it as you get older, even by the teens, I'd say it's kind of it can be stressful. and it can make you anxious. So I've got a few strategies that really help me for that. And I've got one called the 5-4-3-2-1 strategy, where you focus different senses. I use breathing strategies like the 7 breaths in, 11 breaths out strategy. And the thing is, I sit here and I'm focusing on the kind of difficulties that might come with dyspraxia, but I'm also conscious that it comes with strengths that I wouldn't be without. And I think there's a verbal intelligence with dyspraxia that comes up when it's being assessed, and a big vocab. And it's interesting that it's got that language component to it. I think that's fascinating. I also think it's helped with thinking skills. I think there's a kind of lateral thinking outside the box that goes with it that I think can be helpful with problem solving. And I also like the hyperfocus aspect of it, where I can really focus on something when I'm focusing. And I think they're kind of gifts that come with it, really. And the other thing that I have found really helpful over the years is the Dyspraxia Foundation. And I've phoned them for support at times, but I've also found them useful when I've been working in a school and I've had queries about ergonomics in the classroom, for example. So they've been good for that. I think my two key takeaways for dyspraxia, two things that I've learned, are that practicing and not giving up is really important, and that reinforcing things so they become proper knowledge is important too.
So can I sum up what I think you said? So the first one I think was really the importance of exercise. So will you advise anyone, a child or an adult, with not putting words into your mouth, sorry, but a child or an adult, to do exercise regularly, because it helps strengthen the coordination and the muscle tone, etc.
Yeah,
and I suppose
definitely.
look at relaxing exercises to calm the brain, and obviously take advice on how to sort of get right chairs, right equipment. I can never say the word. How do you say that word you just said?
Ergonomics.
Ergonomics. Well, basically, that is how to sit. How to get the right tools, etc., to sit properly. And then, so you said two others, but the last two, forgetting curve, to actually correct the forgetting curve, so constantly go over work, so you
yeah,
reinforce it. Talked about the forgetting curve, and I can't remember the last one now. And the last one was
it the practice one?
Practice, yeah. So
I think because praxis is about practice, really. I just think that you can be. I think with dyspraxia, people can be slow to do a task well, and it can be a struggle when it's new. But if they practice and become proficient, they're as good, if not better, than their peer group. And I think that goes for the physical and the cognitive stuff too.
You've got two courses coming up for Patoss. Could you tell us what those courses are?
Yes, I'm doing one on the physical side of dyspraxia and the literacy side of dyspraxia. And the second webinar is on the cognitive side of dyspraxia in relation to executive function, and also the behavioural consequences and the emotional consequences of dyspraxia. So that's the second one.
They're in the new year, aren't they?
Yeah, the physical dyspraxia one is in January, and I think the dyspraxia and the kind of dyspraxic mind one is in May, maybe.
It is, yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for helping us to celebrate Dyspraxic Week this week. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.